everyone. I'm Sarah Lynne Bowman from the Transformative Play Initiative at Uppsala University. And today we're going to talk about transformative role-playing games implementation basics. So today we're going to talk about the population, the type of game, the facilitation, logistics, preparation, creation, interaction, framing, support, communication, and documentation. Now, obviously, this is a lot of content and we're not going to be able to go into much depth, but hopefully this will provide an overview and a framework for you to think about when you're considering implementing games of any sort, role-playing games, but particularly games for transformative purposes. So the first basic that we're going to talk about is population. What population or populations do you plan to serve with your game? So it could be a general population. This requires you to onboard people who are unfamiliar with role-playing games. They could be adult players, children, elderly, or a mixed group, so people of different ages. For example, if you're running a LARP in a museum, you're not sure who's going to come in. You're running it for a general population. So you're going to have a strong onboarding process to get them into that game. You can't assume they've role played before. Now, if you have an experienced population, that can have sometimes the opposite effect. People have a lot of expectations or calibration that is necessary. So if they're used to a certain play style, you may need to calibrate with them with the rest of the group so that everyone knows the style in which you're playing. Now, there are also youth populations that are often, that people will often run games for, and they have some special considerations. And these are with regard to things like supervision. You know, are you responsible for supervising them? Do they have other people watching them as well? Have you received consent from them or from their parents? Have you received assent from them? These sorts of things. And other considerations around populations are people with special physical needs, special psychological needs, people requiring additional support of some sort. Another thing to just think about is, are the players strangers or are they already familiar with one another? Because that also will require different kinds of strategies often for implementation. So in tabletop role-playing games, assessing the population is especially important. And that's because tabletop tends to work with small group dynamics. And those will vary wildly if you change a person in and out of that group. And they really depend upon people being aligned in terms of their level of familiarity with the game, especially with complex rule sets, their maturity level, their expectations for creative agendas, meaning the types of games that they enjoy playing, their play style preferences, those sorts of things. And so that means that there needs to be some calibration between these players, and sometimes it just doesn't really work out. So in therapeutic settings, it's particularly crucial to choose groups carefully and integrate appropriate content, meaning that there are certain groups that aren't going to mix well together, sometimes because they have certain challenges that are not compatible in a group setting. And there's also problems with content sometimes. For example, if you're working with somebody who has PTSD, who has trauma, and they do not want to work with that kind of content, and then you have someone else in the group who does, it can be a misalignment in the group and can actually lead to dysregulation. So it's really important to create that group container in a way that is harmonious. So as I said, some mental health challenges are not compatible with one another, nor are certain therapeutic goals. So like I said, if someone's trying to process trauma and then another person is just there to learn social skills, it might not be the right tone for the group. Also, in therapeutic settings, they may require specifically trained professionals either to facilitate or assist in some capacity for it to be a therapeutic game. And it's very helpful if that facilitator or the therapist that they're working with has specialties working with that specific population. So somebody may be a therapist, but if they're not an expert on PTSD, then they may not be the best person that's suited to work with that group. So it can be quite sensitive in this area. And in educational role playing, it's crucial to consider the setting in which the facilitation is taking place. Is this a classroom? Is it an after school activity? Is it a camp? Is it a leisure setting? Is it a business class or professional training of some sort, a simulation? Um, Different settings have different facilitation needs, and this also goes back to the age in terms of the populations that you're working with. So for example, there might be different expectations for care. I mentioned supervision earlier. If you're expected to run a game in a classroom, then people might be expecting you to engage in a lot more care and watching over the children than if you were, for example, running a game for a business. There also are different expectations with regard to educational rigor. So some educational games will expect you to be running content that's very connected to their curriculum. Others don't need that at all. Maybe they have different kinds of goals. So thinking about the setting that you're in can make a big difference in terms of how you choose to implement. And they often should include a trained educator in some capacity, whether that's you or perhaps their teacher if they're in the classroom that's working alongside you. And that person might help you facilitate, or maybe they just assist from the side, or maybe they even play a role in the game that allows them to interface and to work with the students as well. But that at the very least, there needs to be buy-in from a trained educator for it to really have its maximum potential. And then that person can also reinforce the lessons before and after the game, which can be very helpful. All right, so let's look at the types of games out there. This has been discussed in other videos, but the type of game will actually make a huge difference in terms of the implementation strategy. So if it's a tabletop, thinking about whether it's a traditional tabletop, maybe one that requires a lot of rules and a lot of prep beforehand, or an indie tabletop that you can pick up at a convention and nobody has to do any preparation. What is the game system, or what is the design of the game, and how might you need to implement accordingly? Then there's LARP. Is it a traditional style of LARP, perhaps a buffer LARP in the woods? Maybe there's mechanics, or maybe it's a theater style LARP where people are playing vampires, or maybe it's an experimental LARP, so it's like held in a black box or something like that. Thinking about the facilitation practices that are necessary for each of those kinds of situations. What is the game system here? Is there a system? Is it a complex system? What is the design trying to gear towards, and how can your implementation support that design? Next is freeform. So which type of freeform is it? There's a lot of different kinds. So Nordic and American freeform are similar, but slightly different. And then freeform in the UK means something totally different. So do your players have a shared understanding of what freeform means in your context? So you may need to, for example, define all of these things on your website or in your materials, however you choose to recruit players, so that everybody has this shared understanding. And then also, is your game intended to be leisure transformational, meaning that it's run in leisure settings and people may or may not have a strong expectation of having a transformative impact? Is it meant to be therapeutic, or is it meant to be educational? Because that will also change your implementation strategies. For example, what sorts of workshops and debriefs you include. Right. So the next basic that we're going to talk about is facilitation. Who will facilitate the game? Will there be one facilitator, or will there be many? So as we talked about, if it's tabletop, that can be a one-on-one session. It can be up to 6, but the ratios do matter, as we'll see in a second. So thinking about how many facilitators you'll need for the amount of people that you have is a really important thing. Are there external responsible parties that are required for coordination? Like I said, therapists, teachers, supervisors, these kinds of people. How will you distribute the responsibilities, if at all, for the logistics? So for example, who's going to play a certain non-player character in a LARP? That might not be the main organizer. That might be another facilitator that gets given that role. Who's going to be in charge of safety? Oftentimes, it's not ideal to have the main organizer be in charge of safety because they're usually handling all sorts of other logistical things and managing the schedule. So perhaps you have external safety people, or you have other facilitators that have been appointed that role. And we'll talk more about that in the support section. Will facilitators change over time, or will they stay consistent? This is important too. You know, maybe you have a long-running Dungeons and Dragons campaign, but you actually decide after a year to let someone else become the dungeon master. That's fine, but this is the kind of thing that will affect the implementation. That person will need to be onboarded, for example, and maybe they have a tonal shift that they need to discuss with the other players. What is your ratio of facilitators to players? So this is something that people don't often think a lot about in my experience, especially since I come from, culture of mainly volunteer labor. So anybody who's willing to help is totally welcome. It's not usually always up to us, especially when we're not running games for profit. Um, how many facilitators we can have. And even if people are running games for profit or for a nonprofit purpose, they may have limits on how many facilitators they can. So to a degree, part of this is practical. And, there's the good to have, and then there's, what might be possible in that particular situation. So take this with somewhat of a grain of salt, but in general, it's often crucial to have facilitator and player contact in transformative games. Now, it may be the case that that contact happens during the workshops and the debrief, or, maybe in the safety room if somebody feels overwhelmed. It doesn't necessarily have to be, intensely facilitated scenes in the moment, but it is important for the people that are involved in this experience to feel held by the process, to feel safe. And often having contact is really important. So in tabletop, a lot of tabletop is focused on this facilitation process. And a group of 6, so one facilitator for 6 people as a ratio, is usually the maximum preferred. 6 people in a group can actually get to be a little bit unwieldy, especially if you have like complex mechanics or you have to take turns. So even a smaller game size can be actually preferable there. But getting over 6 players can really become cumbersome. In therapeutic games, 2 players for every 6, or 2 facilitators for every 6 players can be even better. So I've often heard practice that is optimal is to have one person be the GM, especially if it's a very complex game, who runs the facilitation and the role playing and the rules and all of that. And then there's one person who observes and engages therapeutically on the side. So maybe they're taking notes, or maybe they're guiding the debrief. So they're part of the session, but they're not necessarily part of the game. Now, in LARP, the ratio can vary widely. So for both therapeutic and educational games, 1 to 5 might be optional, or optimal, I should say. Whereas 1 to 10, 1 to 15, 1 to 30, that might be more realistic. If you think about most classrooms, let's say you have 30, 35 students per class, you usually have one teacher. Now, that works well if you have a lecture setting where everybody is being very quiet and looking at the instructor. But if you have a bunch of really, really energetic kids that are all of a sudden given all this agency and this role playing, it can be a bit chaotic and difficult, which is one of the reasons this can be a challenge to implement in classroom settings for people who are not experienced in implementation. So often they may have an outside person who is an expert at this come and run it while they watch, or while they, sort of support in some way. So that's a great situation. So if you're involved in educational role playing, for example, if you can have more supervisors or teachers involved, even in a very small role, it can be really helpful. And when working with special populations for these purposes, the more facilitator support, the better. As we mentioned, sometimes you might need to have an expert facilitator there with specialty in that particular population's needs. So, in terms of facilitation, if we think about traditional role-playing games, they usually have one facilitator, and they're called various roles. Sometimes you'll hear Dungeon Master, which I said earlier. That's the old nomenclature from Dungeons and Dragons, which you'll still find around. Some people will use Storyteller, for example, from the World of Darkness games. Apocalypse World calls that person the Master of Ceremonies. So the facilitator may have various names. But we'll just use facilitator here as a generic term that in this case refers to somebody who's doing a lot of runtime facilitation with the players rather than taking a step back. So each role has the connotation based on the themes and the activities that the design is inviting. So the dungeon master, has this connotation that they are preparing dungeon crawls for characters to navigate as the primary activity. The storyteller has this emphasis on narrating a shared story of personal horror. And Master of Ceremonies has this connotation of being a guide who provides provocative prompts to players, inviting them in with their creative input. So, for example, you see a crying little boy alone in the desert. What do you do? So, putting the creative ball in that person's court. And so keep in mind that whatever words we use, that will shape how other people maybe view the role of the facilitator, and it may shape the way that you view your own role. A lot of people use the term game master. It's pretty consistent, although I would say facilitator is a less loaded term than anything with master in the title. Typically, games have one facilitator and more than one players, as we talked about before. But there are some games that have multiple facilitators at the same time, or rotating facilitators, or even no official facilitator, which is quite interesting. In traditional tabletop, the players are responsible for their characters and maybe one side character, for example, a familiar, a retainer, or a sidekick. And then the facilitator is responsible for everything else in the world. So also enforcing and adjudicating the rules. So everything within the world and also the rules that govern it. That's a lot of responsibility and a lot that the facilitator needs to know in order to be able to run Dungeons and Dragons and other traditional tabletop games. In indie tabletop games, such as mini story games, creative control is more distributed among the players. The facilitator is an active guide, as I just mentioned, towards these interesting narrative moments. So some story games are actually GM-less. That doesn't mean they're not facilitated, as we'll talk about, but games like Fiasco and Dream Askew, that means that all the players have an equal responsibility to create the narrative. And there's actually some games by Alder and Rosenbaum that fall under this category called No Dice, No Masters. And this is belonging outside of belonging, is the type of game that they create. So it's kind of a radical shift in the way that we think about role-playing games for those of us who have been playing them for quite some time. So regardless of whether or not you're playing a GM-less game or not, it is crucial that at least one person knows the basic game design for smooth onboarding and character creation process. So GM-less does not mean that there's no facilitator. It just means that responsibility is distributed. And it may mean that the rules are quite light and there doesn't need to be a lot of facilitation. And the individual who knows the rules might end up becoming the de facto facilitator just because they are the one leading the exercise in that way. So in LARP, implementation teams can become complex, especially as the player count increases. So in larger LARPs, you might have several facilitators, each with different roles. So you might have runtime facilitators that keep the schedule, that organize NPCs, that run plots or mods, as sometimes they're called, these little plots that people can go and choose to play in. Onboarding staff, for example, people who run the registration desk or run the workshops, physical logistics, for example, location management, food and lodging, physical safety, such as first aid and on-site nursing, emotional safety, such as these are usually volunteers who do emotional safety, but if you're lucky, maybe you have a mental health first aid certified person. And if you're really lucky, maybe you have a trained mental health professional or more, one or more there that can help. Safety is really everyone's responsibility, but it's really nice to have facilitators on hand that's their job. So if there is a crisis, they can handle it. Tech and special effects, there might be a different person that is responsible for that. Scenography and audio, and then props, costume, and makeup. You might have multiple people that are doing these kinds of roles, depending on the size of the LARP. Then again, you might have a 3-person LARP in your living room where there's hardly anybody needed. Maybe there isn't a GM needed at all. So your mileage may vary, but one of the reasons we want to talk about facilitation is because it becomes vastly more complex the more people you add. So that's something to think about. What are the logistical details that are necessary for the game to be successfully implemented? Here are some logistics to consider. The first is size. How big will your player base be? Will it be 1 player? Will it be 100 players? Will it be 1,000 players? In what space will the group play? So where is your location? Is it a living room? Is it a school classroom, campsite, a black box? Each of these have different implementation needs. If you already have a living room, then you probably have food and shelter and all of those things fairly nearby. But if you're on a campsite, then you're going to have to reconstruct all of those things. Is the space where you're playing private, semi-public, or public? Can other people watch or interrupt? This is really important because people feel self-conscious when they're playing. And oftentimes when we're playing, we're acting in ways that are very emotive and intense. And that can startle people who don't know what's going on. So having privacy can make a really big difference for everybody involved. It's not always the case that it's necessary, but for the most part, it's often desirable. A big one is cost. How much does it cost to use this location? Will you need insurance or special permissions in order to use the location? Is anyone else entitled to use this space? So, do you have it rented or booked yourself, or can someone else come in at any time and use it? Does the location have any hazards that you need to be aware of, like uneven ground, for example, or rocky terrain? And then, that's related to, are there any issues with accessibility at the location? Are there some things that are going to be really difficult for people who may have disabilities to be able to access? Then there's atmosphere. So one thing is the location itself, and that can provide some atmosphere. If you're running a LARP in a, castle, for example, then, a lot of that atmosphere is taken care of. But there's also ways that you can enhance that setting. If you're running a LARP in your living room, maybe you have to do a little bit more work to create setting, or maybe you need to use a lot of imaginative language to try to get people there. But either way, what atmosphere will you create? In this case, through location, through sound design, scenography, and other factors. I mentioned living room simply because a lot of people do run games out of their homes. And so, there's lots of things that you can do to create ambiance in a home setting. You can get some LED lights, you can play music softly. There's all sorts of strategies that aren't super costly. Another thing about atmosphere is there a certain mood or emotion that you wish to evoke? If so, the use of color, the use of sound, these things might really make a difference. And then again, in terms of atmosphere, sometimes you may have this really awesome tech setup, let's say with these flashing lights, and it's like super cool. And for most of the players, that's going to be awesome, but it actually causes accessibility concerns for people who have seizures, for example, or who get easily triggered. This is also a case if you're playing with extreme heat or extreme cold, if you're playing in the desert, if you're playing, in a blizzard atmosphere or something very cold. Different people have different needs and different capabilities to be in that kind of terrain. Are you playing with sleep deprivation? Is that part of the implementation process to try to keep people awake and alert? And maybe that causes a really intense emotional breakthrough for them, but it also might actually cause problems with any underlying medical conditions they have. So these are the kinds of things you have to kind of weigh. I want to have the cool atmosphere, but I also want to make sure that people are okay. Or I need to tell them ahead of time that this game probably won't be for them, which is a very difficult conversation to have and should be handled very, very gently, because keep in mind that people with disabilities often feel excluded. So, figuring out if there's a way to accommodate is often a really great first start. And then thinking about what tools you'll need. So this is super basic, but you'd be amazed how many of these things we might forget because we're busy thinking about other aspects of the game that we want to put together. So what tools will be needed for the game to be implemented? Does it need dice? Does it need costumes, props? Do you need to have buffer weapons? Do you need some sort of technology like a cell phone that has, linked to an app or something like that? And do you need to actually have your printed character sheet or a set of instructions that you need to read during a workshop? It can be very difficult to run a workshop if you don't have the materials you need. Do you need to have rule books on hand in some way, whether digitally or physically? Even just remembering to have pens can be a really important thing. And this may seem like really trivial, but it actually can make a huge difference. If people can't write down their character sheet, then you're not going to get very far. So, what will you provide or not provide in terms of food, in terms of restroom facilities, in terms of sleeping arrangements? These are the kinds of things to think about, particularly with regard to preparation. So, what preparations are needed to ensure smooth implementation? So, there's preparations on the part of the facilitators, but also preparation on the part of the players. So, they need to know what they need to prepare, and you need to think through all of these different elements, not just the fun game design parts or the cool costuming parts. What will you provide or not provide in terms of like food and all of those kinds of things? What preparations do you and any other facilitators need to make in order for play to begin? So there may be certain things that have to be set up before the game can even start, and that needs to happen ahead of time. And then after that, what kind of cleanup, um, how will cleanup occur? Cleanup will always be necessary on some level, but whose responsibility is that? Is it the whole group's responsibility? Is it the facilitator's responsibility? Is there a cleanup crew that comes in after? How is that all going to work? And then in terms of player preparation, do they need to sign up at a specific time? That's a really important thing for them to know. Do they need to join a social media group in order to engage with this game? Or do they need to join a mailing list to get updates? Do they need to read lore or some sort of curricular materials if it's in an educational setting? Do they need to read the context surrounding the setting that they're in? Like if they're doing a historical LARP, do they need to actually read quite a bit about that time period? And also, you might want to provide ahead of time safety rules so people can prepare ahead of time for the kinds of um, safety rules that they might encounter in the game. Also, just giving people safety rules ahead of time can often help them feel more safe engaging. Um, and other people may feel the opposite, but uh, I do recommend actually foregrounding which safety tools are going to be used in the game. Make connections with co-players. Do they need to calibrate and negotiate consent before they get to the site, or will they have time to do that during the workshops? If you're playing a very intense game with a lot of like intimacy, for example, that might be something that you want to give players an opportunity to connect ahead of time and negotiate those things. However, if you make that mandatory, then people will start to pre-play, and sometimes they will pre-play a lot, and the people who have done a lot of pre-play will often be much more prepared for the game than those who haven't. So you should also probably give some recommendations to your players about the rules around pre-play. There are some games that don't allow pre-play at all, and then there are other games that encourage it. And as a matter of fact, between game sessions, like in a lot of vampire larps, something can happen that can impact everybody's character. So um, having a clear sense of what the expectations are in terms of player relations, and also what is allowed during pre-play and not. Do we have to create characters before we come? Is there going to be a session where we all prepare together and we create characters? Or are the characters pre-written and I need to learn them? I need to memorize them. That can be another facet of this that can be complex? Or do I just show up and I can make a character in 2 minutes? There are games like that too. So those require different needs in terms of facilitation. Again, things like costuming and props are these things that will be provided or things I need to bring. Tents, pillows, towels, sheets. I know this sounds very nitty gritty, but going to a 5-day LARP and then forgetting a towel and not knowing that you needed one can actually make a big difference for some players. Also, do they need to plan any activities that are going to happen in the game in advance? So for example, there's certain LARPs where somebody will be playing a very active player facilitation role where they're actually running chunks of the LARP, even though they're not technically a facilitator. So do they have to like prepare classes ahead of time or rituals? Do they have to perform in front of people? That often means that they might feel like they want to practice for several weeks just to really, hone their performance skills. So these are things to foreground ahead of time. But on the opposite end of that, you can also foreground that this isn't necessary. So you can say some people may choose to perform, whereas others can choose to engage in some other way. So that way people don't feel pressured also for these things. So being very clear about what is expected of what person playing what character can be really helpful. Okay, so in terms of creation, who is responsible for the creation of the fiction? How will world building and character creation occur? So game design is part of the framework, but sometimes it's actually a lot of creation is happening on the fly through emergent play. And it's really, really important to let people know how creation works in this implementation situation. If you're playing a business simulation that's meant to be extremely realistic and they want to come and bring in a dragon all of a sudden, that's going to be really complicated for the people there to try to navigate. So having clear expectations about who gets to world build, who gets to create the characters, who gets to bring in what elements, what tone are you setting, etc., is really important. So does the world building happen during the game as part of a workshop, or does it happen as part of emergent play? Like maybe I just am talking to someone and I decide there's dragons in this world, and all of a sudden now we're going to all act as if there's dragons in this world. That's an example of emergent play impacting the world building. Oftentimes there'll be a world that's already built, and then players will kind of add their own creativity to that, especially in some of these larger games that have a lot of lore. Will it happen before play generated by the players? Like, am I expected to come up with a lot of content? Will it happen in relationship with the facilitators? So sometimes I've run games where we will co-create the character sheet. They will answer an extensive questionnaire based on what they would like to explore, particularly games with transformative impacts. That becomes really important. Like, what do you want to work with? And then I'll create a character sheet based on what I think that they might want to play with, and then they can choose to veto that or make changes, and that's sort of more of a co-creative process in that regard. It also helps establish what not to play with in some ways, because it's like, these are the things we're working on, these are not on the sheet, so they're not going to be main features. But there are a lot of games where everything is pre-designed by the designers, and people have to then faithfully recreate that world. So they're not really at liberty to make any changes, because that might actually interrupt all sorts of narratives that have been set up beforehand by the designers. None of these are better than any of the others. It's just that people should know ahead of time and have their expectations set accordingly. To what degree can player choices impact the game? What is their degree of agency in the game? So all games provide some agency, some feeling that you can actually do something in this world, even if it's sit in the corner and cry, you're still doing something. And the world is in some way maybe responding to you. You're part of it, not just watching it. But different games have more agency than others. We talked earlier about Dungeons and Dragons, where the game master is the person who is in charge of everything about the world. And the players just in charge of the player. And even the player doesn't have full agency. They have a lot of things they can do. They've got all sorts of magic spells, and it can be really exciting, but there are limits to that. So thinking about how much agency a player has is really important to communicate. Players will be incredibly frustrated if they think that they're playing a very collaborative, co-creative game, but they're actually on someone else's railroad. So is there fate play involved? Meaning, are there set things that will happen no matter what? Is there railroading involved, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Some railroaded games can be beautiful and awesome, but everyone needs to sort of agree that they're okay with playing a game that has a preset narrative. Are there little room for changes in the story? Maybe you can add a little flair here and there, but for the most part, you're really sort of simulating someone else's narrative. Will the facilitators take a hands-on role in the story during play? Meaning, are they going to be actively co-creating the world with you, or are they totally hands-off? Are they watching from afar? Sometimes maybe watching remotely, not even in the room or in the building. Are players expected to make their own fun? I put this in quotes because sometimes people will say that about how to have fun at a LARP, for example, where there's a lot of people, you have to learn to make your own fun. There's nothing wrong with that, but people should know that because if they're expecting to be entertained, they might be really disappointed and maybe even disruptive. Do players have important jobs in the game? We talked about this a second ago. Is there time and labor necessary for a game to stay organized and run according to the schedule? This is extremely important to foreground. If the game will not run correctly, if certain players are not doing certain activities at certain times, for example, in a wizard school LARP that has classes and everybody needs to be at that class at that time, the very least the person who agreed to teach that class needs to be there. That needs to be foregrounded. Now, if that player is allowed to not be in that class, and then that becomes an emergent plot, where's the professor? That can be quite interesting too. But if the entire structure of the LARP will fall apart if that person isn't playing that role, then they need to know that ahead of time. And this goes for people who are playing certain leadership characters in game, like, being in charge of the whole colony, for example. That's a pretty important role. The people who are cooks, this is a really important thing because this is an actual physical labor that needs to be done in order for people to eat. It may also be story labor, meaning that the cook is a character and the food maybe has some magical properties or something like that. But this is a critical infrastructural thing that needs to happen. People who play teachers, people who play antagonists. Is it really important that that person stay in the antagonistic role throughout the LARP? Otherwise, the LARP won't run the way that it's designed. That's really important too. Like, do I have a chance to have a narrative arc that's my own choosing? Or if I'm cast in this antagonistic role, do I need to continue to play the antagonist throughout? Again, that can feel a little stifling and railroading, but if players know ahead of time that that's their function, sometimes they really lean into it. Somebody playing an administrator where they're actually doing a lot of in-game social bureaucracy, essentially. And then again, being a performer, is there a whole performance schedule that will fall apart if there isn't a person running the performances, for example? So these are all really important things to think about. And related to that are logistics around those kinds of activities. So if you have a performance schedule, you also need to have probably a microphone, you need to have lights. At the very least, you need to have a way to amplify people's performance so that everybody can hear it if it's a large enough space. So there's things connected to this that also might require labor on the part of the participants, like bringing their own instruments, for example. So we're going to transition now to talk a little bit about game activities. So what kind of activities have you planned for the game? Are there specific things that the players are going to do? Are there modules or little plots that they're going to engage with? What will you prepare for them in addition to the design document or the game structure? Is there something else that's getting added? So a lot of people think of game design as sort of like this neat little tight thing that has already been established, but actually a lot of role-playing games is completely random or emergent play. So once their common saying, of course, is no game survives contact with the players, or no plot survives contact with the players, meaning that the person might, imagine everything's going to go a certain way, and then the players aren't acting exactly the way they imagined. And so that's actually both beautiful and difficult about this particular art form. So oftentimes people have things that are pre-prepared in terms of the game activities. Who will facilitate these activities? Is it the implementation team? Is it NPCs that come from the player base that they're expected to act out this plan? Or is it the players that have to facilitate? Or I should say, who get to facilitate if it's something that they really enjoy doing. And when designing for transformative impacts or therapeutic goals or learning objectives, what are these goals and objectives? Exactly what are you trying to incentivize or make more possible in your players? And if you have these things, do they distract from the transformational goals? So, for example, you might have this really, really cool plot that's really complex and requires all this puzzle solving and stuff. But then when people get involved in the puzzles, they're not interacting at all. And the whole goal of this game was to help people with their social anxiety. Well, you've actually created a plot that runs counter to your original goal, which is to get people to feel more comfortable in social situations. You've given them an alibi to disengage socially. So these are the kinds of things you really need to think about when you start tacking on these different activities into a game. Is, if you're trying to achieve a certain goal, exactly what goal that is, and do all of these parts that you're putting in, do they actually serve that goal? Are these activities mandatory or optional? For example, in education, it's often mandatory what people have to do. But in a leisure LARP or a tabletop game, maybe some players go on this one adventure and then others don't. But some games won't function unless everybody goes on that adventure. So that, again, should be something that people should know ahead of time. And then for certain kinds of activities, are there special safety concerns for them? So are there accessibility issues? Is there any kind of physical or emotional risk involved? And if so, is the activity signposted so that players know this ahead of time? So I've seen people, for example, running a module in the woods and at night, and they have sort of glowing wristbands that they wear that indicate to people, this is for this specific mod that has these specific content warnings attached to them. So you need to have this bracelet if you're going to opt into this particular mod. And that's a really easy way to signal to other people, okay, this person is supposed to be here and has opted into being here. This person maybe is in the wrong place, and we should let them know that this is what's going on. They may still opt in, but these are ways to signal, even during the game, through facilitation, any kind of safety concerns or maybe things that people just might not enjoy doing. And does this signposting happen before the game? Like, for example, having content advisory or ingredients list on your website that has all of the different things that will happen in this game or could happen in this game. Does the signposting happen during the game, like I mentioned with like the wristbands, for example, or does it happen after the game? Sometimes you find out later that this thing happened, and that would have been really helpful to know. It might have been a really cool plot to keep it secret, but if I have a massive phobia of snakes and you have a giant snake monster, not so great to find that out afterwards. Okay. So another facet that we don't often think about, but is really, really important, is interaction. How will the players interface with others? How will they interact with each other during the game? Are they collaborators? Are they antagonists? Are they meant to build each other up, or are they meant to win and try to best the other person? All of these things will make a huge impact on the way that they engage with the game and with each other. Are they part of a group or a faction? Most basic role-playing games have a component of factions in them. Almost all traditional role-playing games have this. A lot of Traditional LARPs have this, and a lot of independent and experimental games have factions. So it's a, humans group together. So it makes sense that we would create games that are about group dynamics and in group and out of group dynamics. So it's a very easy way to create conflict, create tension, but this is something that players should know ahead of time. Because sometimes they can not know that they've opted into some sort of antagonism with factions that they just because they played a character in a game. Is the game meant to be more of an individual experience? Like you're kind of going through your own little journey? Or is it meant to be extensive social interaction? Like, is it really necessary that you are on the whole time and you are communicating with other people for the game to function? These are things to know ahead of time. How will players establish their character relations? We talked a little bit about co-creation. Are the characters co-written or pre-written by the designers or the players or both? Is there a place on social media or another location for people to pre-plan? And is there time during play for calibration of character relations? This is something that I think is really important, which is, you may before a game have decided, oh yeah, I'm really comfortable with this and this and this. And then halfway through the game, decided, actually, I'm not comfortable with that at all. And is there space for people or time set aside by the facilitators for people to calibrate? Sometimes there needs to be, I've been in LARPs where there needs to be emergency calibration, like it's kind of falling apart and everybody's playing their own game. So we need to kind of stop the game and all just discuss as a group where we want things to go after that. So having time and space for calibration can be quite important. How will they interact with the facilitators during game? Are the facilitators playing characters in the game? Will they act as the game system? So will they respond to players' actions based on rules? They might be doing both at the same time. Can they request plots from the facilitators? For example, can you say to a facilitator, I'm really interested in this werewolf plot. Can you create it for me? That's something that some, especially consent-based games, will have as an option, which is really, really cool, but it's not always available. Sometimes the plots are pre-planned and it actually might detract from the whole game experience for everybody else if your werewolf plot suddenly comes in. So how much can the players actually ask for from the facilitators? Can they have other forms of interaction? I mean, the facilitators might not really even be visible for most of the game. And sometimes that's an aesthetic choice because having the facilitator visible breaks people out of the illusion that they're experiencing for some games and for some play cultures. And so I personally think it's really important for facilitators to be visible in some way, or for at the very least for people to know where they can find a facilitator at any time in case there's an emergency or in case there's a crisis or just in case they're really feeling lost and they need some direction. But your mileage may vary depending on your group. How will they interact with the game world and the environment? And this is really important to think about. Like, you may have this really cool set with all these really beautiful props and costumes, but if like the player doesn't know how they're supposed to be interacting in this space or with this space, then it can actually be a little bit disconcerting for them or difficult for them to figure out how to engage. So, for example, are there puzzles or are there other physical challenges that the player needs to engage with? So these are things that are good to know ahead of time, actually, if there's a lot of puzzles in the game. So a puzzle room has it right on the title, right? Like you're going to come here and you're going to solve puzzles. And sometimes there might be more of a role playing or story element, and other times it might just be here's a whole bunch of puzzles with a light story element over it. But a lot of LARPs you don't know ahead of time, or a lot of tabletop games you might be in, thinking that you're just going to roll dice and do tactical play, and then all of a sudden you have to solve a room that has this puzzle. That might be really exciting for some people, but it might not have been what other people have signed up for. So, kind of letting them know what is present there. Um, how much walking or fighting or cooking or other physical activities do they need to play? This is really important. And sitting is also a physical activity. Some people can't sit for large amounts of time. So letting them know ahead of time, we're playing for the next 12 hours and you're going to be seated is really important for people who have that need. Are the players expected to deliver interaction? Like, are they expected to deliver key plot points? In Secrets and Powers LARPs, and also in Finnish LARP, actually, there's a lot of pre-written character information that must be absorbed, and there's pieces of the plot within each of the players that have been seeded. And so the game happens in the interaction between these parts that have been pre-planned in a lot of ways. Not necessarily what's going to happen, but it's been seeded. So if I forget to pass on a crucial bit of information, did I just ruin the game for everybody? This is important for people to know up front. Are the players interacting with the game's content through other players? This is important. Am I learning a really important story part, like a really important secret, through another player deciding to tell me? With transformative role-playing games, we often talk about framing as being really important. So many games have like workshops and debriefs, as well as other pre and post-game activities, including social activities, but some don't. And one thing to consider is, will you include framing in your game? And if so, what kinds of activities? They can be all different kinds of activities, but usually because role-playing is a ritual, having some sort of preparation, and then you have the ritual in between, and then you move into the return or reincorporation phase. Having that framing be established can be very helpful. And in transformative game design, we think it's pretty crucial, actually, and essential. And particularly pre-game preparation for the types of goals and intention of the game, as well as any sort of safety concerns and ways to actually engage with this game, like practicing certain modes of play. And then also after the game, having some form of post-game processing. It doesn't have to be a debrief, but it can be. It can also be journal writing. It can be creating art. We'll talk about that in a second. So how will you frame this game according to your desired transformative impacts and or learning objectives? So you might have very specific things that you want to happen in this game in order to for it to have the impact that you desire. So for example, maybe at some certain point in this game, everybody is going to practice meditation, and that's a collective goal that everybody had ahead of time. Well, remember to foreground that before the game so that people know, okay, there's at a certain point, you're all going to practice mindfulness or meditation. I use this as an example that I've heard from therapists that who engage with this sort of practice with clients. And so, framing it becomes very important, because then if you have this like really high intensity combat sequence that lasts all night, and there's really no, I mean, I guess people could just leave and meditate, but it might not actually be narratively make any sense to do that. Or it might not even be desirable to do that. That might really distract from the impacts that you want. So framing can help everybody steer in the direction of the impact. So what briefings or workshops will you include, and how will they contribute to the desired transformative impacts? And how will debriefing take place? Is it optional? Is it something that will happen in one side room and then everyone else is out partying? I've seen that happen. Maybe people need a debrief and they didn't realize that that room even existed. So making it very clear where certain processing activities will take place. And then there's integration activities. Now, you as a facilitator don't have to, make space for all of these things. But it's important to think about ways for people to process and integrate their experience after the game, especially if you're trying to play for a specific impact. You don't want that impact to be temporary. You want it to actually be there's some sort of takeaway to come out of that, and for that to be integrated into daily life. So thinking about what other post-game integration activities you have planned or that you will encourage your players to engage in. Some examples are creative expression, so journalism, studio art, performance art. People could write their own games. They can engage in fiction writing or storytelling or co-creation. So there's lots of different ways that people might feel inspired after a game and feel the need to create something, or that can actually be built in. I've run a LARP where we had a reflection hour where people were encouraged to express themselves in some way privately, or at least to themselves. And I give them a lot of art objects that they could use that they can then create something with. So that might actually be built into the debriefing process in some cases, which is very interesting, I think. Um, Intellectual analysis. So are they going to engage in contextualization or researching a topic that they just LARPed, or reframing their experiences based on the things that they have now learned? Are they going to engage in documentation or theorizing around this particular topic? Are they going to apply existing theoretical lenses to what they just learned? Are they going to engage in some sort of reflection activity? These are all forms of intellectual analysis that can take place. And again, these are not things that the facilitator necessarily has to make space for. But if you really want a transformative impact to happen, it might be great to have some debriefing questions that guide people in this, and maybe even some activities afterwards that are recommended. So perhaps some links to some websites to go research, or the theory that you used to build this game. Maybe they want to read about that. There's all sorts of ways that people can engage intellectually after a game. And we've been talking about emotional processing, so debriefing, processing bleed. They also might choose to go to individual or group therapy. Maybe the game is part of that process, like they're involved in a therapeutic role playing session where they are with a counselor or a therapist one on one, and then they go and play in the group setting, and then they go back to the counselor and talk about what happened, and use that as a as therapeutic material that can be worked with. There's interpersonal processing, so connecting with other co-players after the LARP or the tabletop game, reestablishing previous social connections that were there. And so coming out of this liminal experience where all these new social connections happening, reconnecting back with previous ones so that you feel more integrated. Also, you may need to negotiate relationship dynamics after a game. Maybe something really profound happened and transformative, and things changed after that. And sharing role playing experiences with others. Some people may be open to hearing them, and others may not. But it can be very powerful to process interpersonally by listening to someone's story, or by letting them, or by sharing your own story. And then one thing that can be really powerful are reunion activities. So sometimes at a convention, people will see each other that played in the same game, or were involved in the same shared activity, and then there will be a reunion where they get to talk about that game for like an hour, or they get to reconnect with the people they played closely with that maybe they haven't seen in a long time. So that can be really powerful as well, because then that can bring up some of the things that they remembered that they had learned from that experience. And maybe it can open up even more room for processing afterwards. Um, you can engage in some rituals that help you return to daily life. So de-rolling, taking off the roll, that can be very ritualized. Uh, Again, narrativizing role-playing experiences. So some people will write journal entries where they'll tell the whole story of what happened. And that can be really powerful because it helps, it not only does it help you distance from the character, but it also kind of makes something that's very ephemeral more concrete, and something that's really chaotic more linear. So that can be actually a really helpful way to return to life, is to kind of put everything in place, mentally, and maybe even like physically in a journal or something like that. And then also distilling any core lessons or takeaways from that experience. So you don't want people to distance so much that they don't really have much of an impact at all. You want them to be able to return to their life with those distilled lessons. Engaging in some kind of self-care activity and grounding practices. This can be really important after transformative experiences, because people are transitioning between different phases of reality or frames of reality, and that can be a little confusing for people. Applying certain experiences or skills that they've learned in other settings outside of the game, that can be really powerful. So having stepped up into a leadership role in a game, and then maybe stepping into a leadership role at work and trying it out. That can be really powerful, especially for someone who didn't think that they were capable of that before. Incorporating personality traits or behaviors from that character that you want to take with you, that can be pretty powerful as well. And then lastly, there's community building. So networking, planning events that will happen afterwards, collaborating on projects together. So there's a lot of games that are born from other games. And so maybe people had a certain kind of experience and then they connected with one another and then they started creating a new game as a result. Also creating new social systems. I mean, there's LARPs that have been so transformational for some people that the community itself becomes its own really, really supportive, nurturing environment. And that's the goal. That's the hope, is that people will continue to have powerful connections with others. I should say there are some people that would prefer to have a transformative experience and then go do their own thing, and that's totally fine. But a lot of people are seeking community when they come to these games. So ideally, if that can continue, that's great. Sharing resources and knowledges with each other and establishing safer spaces for people to feel more comfortable being themselves. Ironically, some people might feel more comfortable expressing themselves in a LARP than they do in daily life for various reasons. And creating implicit and explicit social contracts with the community and engaging in related subcultural activities that are related to that. Maybe you have a board game night, which is related. It's not exactly role playing, but it becomes part of a subculture. And then evolving or innovating existing social structures. I mean, this is pretty intense, and not everybody's going to do this, but there are some people that will play a game that they found particularly transformative and then go try to change the structure that they're within if it has some level of toxicity or some sort of problematic aspect to it. And that is pretty remarkable, actually, that a game can inspire people to feel like they can do that. Of course, they probably could have always done that, but the agency of the role-playing game and the things that they explored within it, maybe the states of being that they inhabited, made them feel that that was possible. So again, as an implementer, you're not necessarily saying, okay, I'm going to provide the framework for you to go change the world. Well, we can't do that. We don't have that power. But what we can do is we can support people who want to take the initiative and create positive social change for others and for themselves. And that can be part of the community that's built by that implementation strategy. So next we have support. What can players expect in terms of support throughout the process? How will players be instructed to support one another before, during, and after play? So again, support is not just for the players. It's from the facilitators. It should be something that players also feel a little bit of responsibility for. But thinking of how they'll be instructed to do that. So how do they check in with someone else? How do they calibrate with someone else? When is it appropriate to do so? And if someone needs help, what do you do? These kinds of things can be foregrounded in the workshop or on the website or both. What safety mechanics or techniques will you use? How will the facilitators support players before, during, and after play? Are the facilitators like, you're on your own? Or are they going to be there? And how is it signaled that they're going to be there? Is there a special room that people should go to? Will there be additional responsible parties that will support emotional well-being and learning before, during, or after? So we talked already about teachers and counselors and how they can sometimes bookend these activities. Well, they can also provide learning and support through that process, which might be complicated and messy. How can the players contact facilitators if they need assistance? We talked about this a little bit. Will they be there physically or somewhere else? Is there a phone number they can call? Are there walkie-talkies? How does it work? And importantly, will there be a safety team? And if so, what are their responsibilities? How can they be located? So if something goes wrong, whether it's physical or emotional safety, or if somebody just feels overwhelmed, where do they go? It can be very confusing to have that happen while in a game and then have to try to navigate, especially if someone is feeling really overwhelmed or confused or triggered. and you're on this massive site where there's lots of different buildings. Where do you go? Like making that very clear to people can be very helpful. And then related to that, will there be an off game room or sanctuary space for players to decompress or to process their emotions? And it's often nice to have a space like this where it feels really comfortable. There's lots of, maybe comfy chairs, maybe even little blankets or coloring books, earphones, but it has soft music playing, maybe some chocolate, some water. It may not be that this person needs a ton of emotional support, but they may just need a little place to unwind. And is that space there for people to talk to the safety team, or is it something separate? So you might have a space that serves both functions, but if somebody has an emergency, do they go to that room or do they go to another room? And then we have communication. So how will the facilitators communicate with players and vice versa throughout the process? So how will you promote and recruit players? Where do your players come from? Will you have a website, a social media page, a discussion group where anyone can post? Or is it just asking some friends at work if they'd like to play a game with you? Um, how will players contact you before, during, and after the game sessions? So this is the before, how will you recruit, but then also how can they contact you? How often will you be available for contact? There are some facilitators that are like, I am not available to talk about plot in between games. You can ask me about logistical questions, but I'm not going to talk about the game content with you. And then there are others that really enjoy talking about the plots with the players and processing it. So just being really clear about the expectations there and the availability there is important. And then also, how often will you contact the players? If someone signs up for a LARP and then doesn't hear anything for 6 months, they're likely to feel a little confused about what's expected of them. So, maybe having, even if the LARP is many months ahead of time, maybe sending out an email every month or so saying, hey, we're still really excited to have you. Here are some things that you might want to know in preparation, or could just be a check-in. But how often will you contact players is something to think about. When and how will you deliver key information? So, how much goes on your website? This is actually super important. How much of the information goes on the website or in your game design document? Don't assume that everybody reads all of the lore, all of the rules, and all of the things that are on your website or say game design document. That's a common facilitation mistake. While, of course, you may say you need to read these rules or read the site in order to play this game, people may have read it and not really understood it or may not have had time. So, front loading information can be helpful, but don't expect that people have memorized that information. Some people have, learning disorders that make it difficult for them to read large text. So these are things to think about. How much is sent in emails or in logistics documents before game? Like I said, maybe a month before game, you get an email with a bunch of logistics that will help you plan your trip if you're going somewhere. How much is shared in a briefing before the game or in a workshop? And how much of this information is shared during game? So things that you didn't know were going to happen all of a sudden are happening. And then how much is disclosed after a game? So sometimes there'll be key pieces of information, as we've talked about, that are given after the game. And that, sometimes that can be quite fun to find out a secret that you didn't know, for example. But sometimes it might be very frustrating to find out after a game that the game had certain content that you didn't feel comfortable with, for example. How will you record what occurs before, during, and after the game? This is about documentation. So, not everybody engages in documentation practices, and that's totally fine. But increasingly, more and more people do, especially in like the larger international arts or the more international in scope. So, are there photos that are being taken? Are there videographers there? Are there journalists that are pretending to take notes and are actually creating some documentation as a result of that? There might be people that are documenting in game versus off game. So there might be a photographer in the game that's actually a character that you can interact with. There may be only documentation happens in that corner. And so everyone knows that nothing that happens over here is going to be filmed. That can be really important for them to feel safe opening up. Um, how will you inform players and how will you obtain consent for their documentation? So can players opt out? And if so, how? You could say on your website or at the briefing, by playing this LARP, you are agreeing to be documented, and that's it. But letting people know ahead of time so that they can either opt out of the game or opt out of the procedure if possible is really, really helpful. Some people don't feel comfortable at all with other people seeing them in states of play. Some for very good reasons. Maybe they were shamed as a child for having these interests. Maybe they're worried that if their work finds out they were engaged in this kind of play, that they might misunderstand what it means and might get fired as a result. So these are things to think about. And again, will the documentation interrupt the game? Will taking a bunch of pictures be really disruptive if you're playing a game from the Middle Ages? Will it inhibit players' actions? And then finally, in what contexts or publication venues will this documentation be used? So some people might be fine with documentation as long as it stays on a private photo album that only other players can access. And then maybe they can share their photo, but not other people's photo, or they can share photos with other people's consent that everybody in the picture agrees that it's fine. And with the photographer's consent as well is really important because photographers are artists and sometimes they really want to be credited. So, do you have permission to actually reprint these images? In what contexts and which publication venues? So thinking about that, you may not know all of this ahead of time, of course, but maybe you check in with your players after the game and you say, hey, I have an opportunity to publish in this one place, just letting you know that's happening. If anybody would like to send me photos from the game that they would feel comfortable being in this publication, please let me know. Or here's an album. These are putting together an album of photos that have been approved for publication purposes, that sort of thing. And in general, every time you republish a photo, it's probably a good idea to check in with the person. You don't always have that option. Maybe you don't know who they are, you don't have their email address or whatnot, but it's good practice if their image is being used in a particular way. And then, is this documentation meant for private or for public consumption? So is this documentation meant for a small group, like I said, or is it meant for the whole world is going to see this and this is going to be what LARP looks like from now on or tabletop looks like from now on? All right, so some takeaways. Game design is only a small part of the whole role-playing experience. Um, there's all sorts of implementation aspects that need to be taken into consideration aside from just the game design. And those things are factors that are game design, actually. Implementation is an important part of game design. Players need to feel safe in order to surrender into a transformative experience. So considering the many facets of implementation will make for a smoother experience for everyone involved. And planning ahead of time will help avoid complications arising during the implementation process. So again, my name is Sarah Lynne Bowman from Uppsala University. I'm part of the Transformative Play Initiative at the Department of Game Design. So I would love to hear from you. Thank you.